Back in my underrated Neo Discovery video, I mentioned Discovery Forretress and talked a bit about how I thought it had a lot of potential and I don't know why it saw more play. Well, I've tried messing around with it and I've got a little bit more understanding of Forretress and why it didn't see as much play. But originally, I had planned to upload a Forretress build to the channel and also a separate Light Golduck build. But then I realized that if you just mash them together, Forretress gets a lot better. Not only does Light Golduck offer an amazing offensive component to complement Forretress's more passive defensive component, but it also covers Forretress's weakness, allowing it to actually compete against your Typhlosions, your Macargos, your Houndooms. More on that offensive power here in a second, because first I do want to focus on Forretress. Its rapid spin attack is comparable to the playstyle of that Genesis Donphan. The main difference being that there's less damage, but Forretress can take advantage of that special metal energy and become a lot more defensive. And the damage isn't really going to matter all that much. It is a nice little chunk of damage, but rapid spin is more for putting your opponent in a position where they feel like they need to swap one of their bench Pokemon back into the active position, and that's where Spikes comes into play, the main draw of this card. Spikes only kicks in during your opponent's turn, so you can't play Double Gust on your turn, pull out a Pokemon and deal damage to it with Spikes. Your opponent is the one that has to be promoting a bench Pokemon to the active position before it gets damaged. But Spikes is also stackable, so if you've got 3 Forretress on your bench, then anytime your opponent promotes a Pokemon to the active position on their turn, it's going to deal 30 damage. And that seems pretty easy to avoid for your opponent, but think about Neo On and how often your opponent will just put a Cleffa with a Focus Band into the active position just to stall you out for a few turns while they can get the rest of their setup done. You take away that option by having 3 Forretress on your bench because they can't promote a Cleffa without knocking it out. Now on to Light Golduck, whose Core Blast attack can deal massive damage to most of the decks in the Neo On metagame. Core Blast is going to be dealing 30 damage plus 20 more for each special energy card, so this is going to help knock out some more problematic tanky Pokemon like Scizor, Steelix, Metal Chansey, because even if your opponent just has a Recycle energy on it, Core Blast is going to be dealing 50 damage. This is also going to be increasing damage for Darkness energy, Metal energy, Warp energy, Potion energy, so it's a pretty good anti-meta card, in addition to just being a good water type attacker to help cover Forretress's fire weakness. So those are our primary Pokemon. What does the rest of the deck look like? No Cleffa here in this deck because kind of this late into the metagame, enough decks had counters to Cleffa that really we're going to be relying on good old Copycat for setup, hoping that your opponent has played their own Eek. Instead, we're moving straight on into a full playset of Pineco. There are 2 different Pinecos in the Neo block that you can use. I just prefer this one. They both have 40 HP. But accompanying that will be a full playset of Forretress because you want to stack as many of those spike powers on your bench as possible. That way, when you force your opponent into a situation where they need to promote a Pokemon from bench to active, you're dealing as much damage as possible without even having to attack. The same thing goes for Psyduck. There's a few options here. I just went with this one because I had them handy. There is also the Legendary Collection Psyduck that got reprinted that is maybe better. It's just, I didn't want to search for them. The Psyducks don't really matter as much as just getting them evolved up into Light Golduck and attacking with Core Blast. So 3 copies of the Psyduck and Golduck, and then throwing in 1 Elekid, just in case you get a little bit energy screwed, you can't actually attack, maybe you don't have enough spikes set up to really start dealing damage. Elekid can step in and help you out and can also stall for a bit if you just put it in the active position and your opponent can't hit their coin flips. For draw support, we've got a full playset of Professor Elm to cover for the lack of Cleffa support in this deck. Professor Elm does the same job pretty much, maybe gets your setup a little bit faster since you can go ahead and get your Pinecos and your Psyducks into play. And like I said earlier, 3 copies of Copycat so that you can kind of capitalize off of your opponent's use of Cleffa, or even if they just got a big hand for whatever reason that early in the game, copy it with Copycat. 3 copies of Pokemon Fan Club, just so you can get all of your basics down onto the bench. You want to fill up with Pinecos as fast as you can. That way you can fill up with Forretress as fast as you possibly can. Got a couple copies of Town Volunteers in here as well to recycle Pokemon and energy as needed. A full playset of Power Charge as well, so that you can recycle back all of those metal energy, which are going to make Forretress a little bit tankier, let them survive longer if they do get pulled into the active position. And also, if you just want to pull Rapid Spin shenanigans, you're able to, because you can get all those metal energy back, get them down onto Forretress, and start moving around Pokemon at your opponent's displeasure. And speaking of moving Pokemon back and forth, that's kind of what this deck is all about. So a full playset of Double Gust, so that you can kind of force your opponent into situations where they feel like they have to swap a benched Pokemon into the active position, thus activating Spikes. Now when you use Double Gust, you're going to have to move around your own Pokemon too, so Balloon Berry is there to help out with your Forretresses and their high retreat cost. You can also throw one of these down onto a Golduck if you don't want to spend the energy off of it, just to retreat it into something else. But between Rapid Spin, Balloon Berry, and Double Gust, you should be able to move Pokemon around however you want, as long as you've got the cards available. Also doing a full playset of Goldberry, just to bulk up those Forretresses a little more, as well as Light Golducks. If those are your primary attackers for that particular matchup, you want to keep those Golducks alive as much as possible, and so attaching Goldberries and healing off those chunks of damage a little at a time are really going to help. Running a full playset of Metal Energies, and like I said, you can bulk up those Forretresses, make it a little harder to knock them out. That way you can fully utilize Spikes as much as possible, keep those Forretress on the field as much as possible. Also doing a couple copies of Warp Energy, just as some extra backup for moving around your own Pokemon, making sure you're not stuck with a Forretress in active position that doesn't have any energy on it, anything like that. That's kind of the weakest point of this deck, is when you're stuck with a Pokemon in the active position that you feel you need to move back to the bench, but you kind of run out of options for doing so, and you don't want to give your opponent the extra time to get their setup and start knocking out your Pokemon. Playset of Recycle Energy, that way you're not having to rely on Town Volunteers as much. It's going to work for both Golduck and a Forretress, whichever ones you're going to be attacking with. And then the rest of the deck is filled out with Psychic Energy for Golduck's big ol' Core Blast attacks. I mentioned at the start of the video I had separate builds originally for Forretress and also Light Golduck. For that original Forretress build, I had paired it with Crobat. With the threat of triggered poison, your opponent's instinct would be to just swap out Pokemon to get rid of the effect of triggered poison. In doing so, they would trigger Spikes and take damage. But the deck wasn't super consistent. It was fun using Crobat in this way paired with Forretress, but like I said, it wasn't winning a lot of games with that build. Just know that this is another potential partner, and for that deck's fire coverage, I had included a copy of Quillfish. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there is a Legendary Collection Psyduck that can also utilize those Psychic Energies to help you get a setup by drawing cards. Like I said, I kind of just used the Neo Psyduck because I had them on hand in the binder. I didn't feel like going back and searching through my fossil cards to pull out these Psyducks, but the option is there. Even with the Light Golduck in this deck, it can still struggle against fast attacking fire types like Dark Houndoom. It handles the slower build-up fire type decks like those that rely on Entei and Typhlosion a lot better. Even when faced with decks that don't use any special energy at all, Forretress can still hold itself pretty well as long as it's got 1 or 2 metal energy attached to it, meaning that it's going to take reduced damage from your opponent's attacks. And then it can really just kind of spread that damage around as it hits Pokemon after Pokemon with Rapid Spin, trying to take control of the playing field as much as possible. Honestly, the deck's real weakness is just when your opponent gets a great setup, and it doesn't matter how much you move their Pokemon around, they're still able to just do exactly what they want to, which kind of defeats the purpose of this deck and takes away any sense of control you really have. And so it really just becomes a war of attrition at that point, where you're trying to move things around and spread damage as much as possible, but then your opponent just keeps attacking and their deck functions the way it's supposed to anyway. Now I want to hear your thoughts. What Pokemon do you think should be paired with Forretress? I know there's a lot of options out there for spreading damage, moving damage counters. I actually talked about it a little last time with that Ghost Bear deck. Also, let me know any experiences you have with this deck or any decks you would like to see on the channel. Plenty more content on the way, so just hit me up, and I'll see you next video. Bye.